The courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activity as a young man in an ill-fitting suit walked through the heavy wooden doors. His clothes were clearly second-hand, but his eyes sparked with determination as he carried a worn leather briefcase filled with carefully organized papers. At just 23 years old, Alex Chen stood out among the seasoned attorneys who regularly frequented these halls. That morning, he was representing himself in a case against a powerful real estate company. The company had wrongfully evicted several families from their apartment complex, including his elderly grandmother, claiming building code violations that didn't exist. While other tenants had simply accepted their fate and moved on, Alex couldn't let this injustice stand. Judge Richard Thompson sat at the bench, his expression a mixture of amusement and irritation as he looked down at the young man standing before him. The opposing counsel, a team of 3 corporate lawyers in expensive suits, smirked among themselves. They had handled dozens of similar cases, and this inexperienced kid would be just another easy victory. "You realize you're going up against one of the largest real estate firms in the city?" Judge Thompson asked, barely concealing his skepticism. A few chuckles echoed through the courtroom. "Are you sure you wouldn't rather have professional representation?" Alex stood straight, his voice clear and unwavering. "Your Honor, I've spent the last 6 months studying tenant rights law. I've documented every violation of the state housing code committed by the defendants, and I'm prepared to present evidence that they fabricated the building inspection reports." The judge raised an eyebrow, but Alex was already pulling out meticulously organized documents from his briefcase. As he began presenting his case, the smirks on the corporate lawyers' faces slowly faded. Alex had photographed every inch of the apartment complex, interviewed former maintenance workers, and uncovered a pattern of fraudulent practices that extended far beyond just one building. What the judge and opposing counsel didn't know was that Alex had been preparing for this moment since he was 16. Growing up in a struggling immigrant family, he had watched his parents work multiple jobs to provide for him and his siblings. When his grandmother moved in with them after losing her life savings to a previous housing scam, Alex had devoted himself to understanding the law. He couldn't afford law school, but he had practically lived in the public library, studying legal textbooks and precedent cases. He had attended every free legal workshop he could find and volunteered at legal aid clinics, absorbing knowledge like a sponge. His photographic memory and natural analytical abilities had turned him into a self-taught legal expert in tenant rights. As Alex methodically presented evidence of falsified inspection records and manipulated maintenance logs, the courtroom's atmosphere shifted. The corporate lawyers exchanged worried glances as they realized their usual tactics wouldn't work against this unexpectedly formidable opponent. Judge Thompson leaned forward, his initial amusement replaced by genuine interest as Alex cited relevant cases and statutes with the precision of a seasoned attorney. The young man wasn't just fighting for his grandmother's apartment, he was exposing a systematic scheme that had affected dozens of families across the city. His presentation included testimonies from other tenants, documentation of similar cases in other properties owned by the same company, and evidence of a pattern of deliberate negligence designed to force out long-term residents so the building could be converted into luxury apartments. As the morning wore on, the judge's expression transformed from skepticism to admiration. This wasn't just a young man with a grievance, this was someone who had done his homework and understood the law better than many practicing attorneys. The corporate lawyer's attempts to dismiss his evidence were met with well-researched counterarguments and additional documentation. When Alex finished presenting his initial arguments, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. Judge Thompson removed his glasses, studying the young man before him with newfound respect. The same people who had laughed at Alex's appearance just hours earlier now watched him with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "Mr. Chen," the judge said, his tone notably different from his earlier dismissive attitude, "I must say, I'm impressed by your preparation and understanding of the law. You've presented compelling evidence that warrants a full investigation of these allegations." The corporate lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Judge Thompson continued, "Furthermore, I believe this case may have implications beyond just one apartment complex. I'm ordering a temporary injunction against all eviction proceedings by the defendant company pending a complete review of their practices. Alex stood quietly, his hands trembling slightly with emotion but his voice steady as he thanked the judge. As he gathered his documents, he caught a glimpse of his grandmother sitting in the back of the courtroom, tears of pride streaming down her face. This was just the beginning. He had opened the door for dozens of other families to seek justice. As word of the hearing spread through the courthouse, other tenants' rights advocates and legal aid attorneys approached Alex, amazed by his comprehensive understanding of housing law and his courage in taking on such a powerful opponent. What had started as one young man's fight for his grandmother's home was about to become something much bigger, a landmark case that would expose systemic abuse in the city's real estate industry. The days following the initial hearing transformed Alex's life in ways he never expected. His tiny apartment, which he shared with his parents and grandmother, became an unofficial headquarters for displaced tenants seeking help. Every evening, after finishing his shift at the local grocery store, he would sit at their worn kitchen table, listening to stories that echoed his own family's struggles. One particular evening, an elderly couple brought him a shoebox full of documents they'd kept over the years. Inside, Alex discovered a gold mine of evidence: old maintenance requests that had been ignored, photographs of deteriorating conditions, and copies of suspicious rent increases. But what caught his attention most was a pattern in the paperwork that suggested the real estate company's practices went far beyond their city. "This goes deeper than we thought," Alex muttered to himself, spreading the papers across the table. His grandmother watched from her corner of the kitchen, quietly making tea as she had done every night since he was a child. She understood the weight of what her grandson had taken on. She could see it in the dark circles under his eyes and the way his shoulders tensed as he pored over documents late into the night. The corporate lawyers weren't taking their courtroom defeat lying down. They had begun a subtle campaign to discredit Alex, suggesting he was just a troublemaker seeking attention. Anonymous comments appeared on local news websites, questioning his motives and expertise. But their tactics backfired when a junior associate from their firm, troubled by his company's actions, secretly reached out to Alex. The whistleblower, a first-year lawyer named Ray, met Alex in a small coffee shop far from the downtown legal district. "What you've uncovered is just the tip of the iceberg," Ray explained, nervously glancing around the nearly empty cafe. "The company has been doing this for years, targeting immigrant communities and elderly residents across multiple states. They count on people being too intimidated or resourceless to fight back." Alex listened intently, taking careful notes. Ray's information filled in crucial gaps in his investigation, providing names, dates, and details that would prove invaluable. But more importantly, it confirmed what Alex had suspected: this wasn't just about one building or one neighborhood. It was about a systematic exploitation of vulnerable people who couldn't afford to defend themselves. As news of Alex's initial victory spread, local media began taking interest in the story. A community newspaper reporter interviewed him, and suddenly his phone was ringing with calls from other journalists. The attention made him uncomfortable. He had always preferred working quietly behind the scenes, but he recognized that public awareness could help protect other families from similar exploitation. The corporate legal team's next move was to offer a settlement. They invited Alex to a meeting in their gleaming downtown office building, where he found himself sitting across from the company's chief counsel in a conference room that probably cost more than his family's annual income. The offer was substantial, enough money to buy his grandmother a comfortable new home, plus additional compensation for other affected families. "This could all be over by tomorrow," the chief counsel said smoothly, sliding the paperwork across the polished table. "Everyone gets paid, everyone's happy. You've made your point, and quite impressively, I might add. Why drag this out?" Alex studied the document carefully, his mind racing. The settlement would solve his family's immediate problems, but it would also include a non-disclosure agreement. All the evidence he had gathered, all the patterns of abuse he had uncovered, would have to remain secret. Future tenants would have no warning, no protection against the same predatory practices. "I need time to consider this," he said finally, gathering his belongings. The chief counsel's smile didn't reach his eyes as Alex left the building. That night, Alex couldn't sleep. He sat on the fire escape outside their apartment, watching the city lights and thinking about all the families who had shared their stories with him. His mother joined him, bringing a plate of his favorite dumplings she had made despite her exhaustion after a double shift at the hospital where she worked as a custodian. "You know," she said softly in their native language, "when we first came to this country, everyone told us to keep our heads down, not make trouble. But your father and I always taught you kids to stand up for what's right." She squeezed his hand. "Whatever you decide, we're proud of you." The next morning, Alex walked back into Judge Thompson's courtroom with renewed determination. The corporate lawyers were already there, confident their settlement offer would end the matter. Instead, Alex presented new evidence from Ray and the documents he had gathered from other tenants, requesting the case be expanded into a class action lawsuit. "Your Honor," Alex addressed the court, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "this case isn't just about one building or one company's actions in our city. We've uncovered evidence of a systematic pattern of discrimination and fraud that affects thousands of families across multiple states. These practices target our most vulnerable citizens, the elderly, immigrants, and low-income families who lack the resources to defend themselves." Judge Thompson listened intently as Alex outlined the broader scope of the company's activities. The corporate lawyers' faces darkened as they realized their settlement strategy had backfired. Their clients' practices were about to be exposed on a much larger scale than they had anticipated. As Alex concluded his presentation, the courtroom was silent except for the soft sound of Judge Thompson shuffling through the new evidence. The judge looked up, studying the young man who stood before him with even more confidence than he had shown in their first encounter. "Mr. Chen," the judge said finally, "you've presented compelling evidence that warrants a full investigation at the federal level. I'm referring this case to the Department of Justice's Housing and Civil Rights Division." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "Furthermore, I'm appointing you as a special advisor to the investigation, given your extensive knowledge of the case." The corporate lawyers burst into objections, but their protests fell on deaf ears. Alex stood quietly, thinking about all the nights he had spent studying law books in the public library, all the times people had dismissed him because of his age or background. Now, those same hours of preparation were about to help bring justice to families across the country. As he left the courthouse that afternoon, Alex was surprised to find a group of tenants waiting for him. They weren't just from his building anymore, word had spread, and people had come from all over the city to share their stories and offer support. Among them, he spotted Ray, who gave him a subtle nod of acknowledgement. The federal investigation brought both new opportunities and challenges that Alex never anticipated. As he walked into the local FBI field office for the first time, carrying his now famous worn briefcase, he couldn't help but think about how far this case had come from its humble beginnings in Judge Thompson's courtroom. The FBI had assigned Special Agent Lisa Wu to lead the investigation. She was a veteran of housing fraud cases, but even she was impressed by the meticulous nature of Alex's research. "I've been doing this for 15 years, she told him as they reviewed his files, "and I've never seen documentation this thorough from a civilian." But while Alex worked with federal investigators, the real estate company launched a sophisticated campaign to protect their interests. They hired a crisis management firm, and suddenly local media outlets were running stories about how their urban renewal projects were actually helping communities. They highlighted charitable donations they'd made to local organizations and portrayed themselves as misunderstood community partners. The pressure began to affect Alex's personal life in unexpected ways. The grocery store where he worked suddenly found reasons to cut his hours, forcing him to take a second job as a night security guard to help support his family. Anonymous callers repeatedly tried to get his parents fired from their jobs. His younger sister, a high school student, came home crying one day because classmates were saying their family was trying to destroy the city's economy. One rainy evening, as Alex waited for the bus after his security guard shift, a black SUV pulled up beside him. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, his shoes splashing in the puddles. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the man said quietly. "People get hurt when they dig too deep into things that don't concern them. Your grandmother still lives in that building on Pine Street, doesn't she?" Alex felt his heart race, but kept his voice steady. "Everything you say is being recorded," he replied, holding up his phone. "And threatening a federal witness is a felony." The man's face tightened, and he quickly returned to his vehicle. As the SUV drove away, Alex's hands shook as he called Agent Wu to report the incident. The threats only strengthened the community's resolve to support Alex. Local business owners who had faced similar pressure from the real estate company began speaking out. A retired judge offered free office space where Alex could meet with affected families. Law students from the nearby university volunteered to help organize documents and interview witnesses. What had started as one young man's fight was becoming a movement. Ray, the whistleblower from the real estate company, continued providing crucial information, though his position became increasingly precarious. "They're shredding documents," he told Alex during another clandestine meeting. "But I've been making copies. They're not just targeting low-income housing, they're involved in commercial real estate fraud too. They've been falsifying environmental impact reports for their development projects." The case took an unexpected turn when Alex discovered a connection between the real estate company and several local politicians. Hidden behind layers of shell companies and fake names, he found evidence that certain city officials had been receiving kickbacks for fast-tracking building permits and looking the other way during inspections. Working late one night in the donated office space, Alex received an urgent call from his mother. His grandmother had fallen ill and been taken to the hospital. When he arrived at the emergency room, he found out that the building's heating had been shut off despite the cold weather, affecting several elderly residents. The company claimed it was due to emergency maintenance, but Alex knew better. The next morning, Alex walked into Judge Thompson's courtroom again, this time with Agent Wu beside him. The evidence they presented showed how the company's retaliatory actions against witnesses constituted federal crimes. Judge Thompson's face grew darker with each new piece of evidence. "This court will not tolerate witness intimidation," the judge declared, his voice sharp with anger. He issued an immediate restraining order against the company and ordered federal marshals to protect the affected properties. The company's lawyers sat in stunned silence as their tactics backfired spectacularly. News of the political corruption angle caught the attention of national media. Suddenly, Alex found himself being interviewed by major networks. He stuck to his principles, always shifting the focus back to the affected families rather than himself. "This isn't about me," he would say. "This is about people's basic right to safe, stable housing, and about holding powerful interests accountable when they abuse their position." The investigation scope continued to expand. Other whistleblowers, encouraged by Ray's example, began coming forward. A former accountant for the company provided records showing how they had hidden their illegal profits. A city building inspector admitted to being bribed to falsify reports. Each new piece of evidence reinforced the pattern Alex had first identified in his grandmother's case. One evening, as Alex sat with his family at dinner, his father quietly placed a letter on the table. It was from the State Bar Association, offering Alex a special opportunity to take the bar exam despite not having attended law school. His documented work on the case and proven legal expertise had convinced them to make an exception to their usual requirements. "We always knew you were meant for something special," his father said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've helped so many people already. Imagine what you could do as a real lawyer." Agent Wu's investigation was uncovering more evidence every day, but it also revealed the true extent of the company's influence. They had similar operations in dozens of cities across the country, each following the same playbook of targeting vulnerable communities and using political connections to avoid scrutiny. The case was becoming a watershed moment in housing rights law. Legal aid organizations around the country began using Alex's research methods to investigate similar schemes in their cities. Law schools started incorporating the case into their curriculum as an example of how systematic research and community organizing could challenge powerful interests. But for Alex, it always came back to the people at the heart of the case. Each evening, he would visit his grandmother in the hospital, where she was recovering slowly. Other elderly residents would stop by her room, sharing stories and offering support. They had formed their own kind of family, brought together by their fight for justice. As he sat by his grandmother's hospital bed one night, Alex reflected on how much had changed since that first day in court when everyone had laughed at him. The case had grown far beyond what he had initially imagined, but its essential truth remained the same: one person willing to stand up for what's right could inspire others to do the same, creating a wave of change that no amount of money or power could stop. The decision to take the bar exam weighed heavily on Alex's mind as the federal investigation continued to unfold. Every spare moment between his security guard shifts and case work was now devoted to studying. His tiny bedroom had become a maze of law books borrowed from the public library, with sticky notes marking important passages and case laws. The political corruption angle of the case exploded in unexpected ways. One morning, as Alex arrived at the donated office space, he found Agent Wu waiting with breaking news. The FBI had raided several city officials' homes and offices overnight. "Your documentation of the building permit irregularities gave us the probable cause we needed," she explained, spreading photographs across the desk. "But what we found goes way beyond housing fraud." The evidence uncovered in the raids revealed a complex web of corruption that had infected multiple city departments. Building inspectors, zoning officials, and even members of the city council had been involved in schemes that went back more than a decade. The real estate company hadn't just been bribing officials, they had been helping launder money from other illegal operations through their property developments. As news of the raid spread, Alex's phone began ringing non-stop. Journalists wanted comments, other investigators wanted information, and more whistleblowers wanted to share their stories. But the call that caught him off guard came from an unexpected source, the state's Attorney General. "We've been watching your case closely," the Attorney General said during their meeting in her office. "What you've uncovered here could help us reform housing laws across the state. We want you to consult with our Housing Rights Task Force, even before you take the bar exam." The company's desperate attempts to maintain control became increasingly obvious. They launched a smear campaign, trying to paint Alex as an attention-seeking troublemaker who was destroying the city's development prospects. They hired private investigators to dig into his past and his family's immigration history. But their tactics only served to make more people sympathetic to his cause. One evening, as Alex was leaving his security guard shift, he found Ray waiting in the parking lot, looking nervous. "They know I'm the leak," Ray said, his voice shaking. "They're planning to frame me for embezzlement. They've already planted false evidence in the company's financial records." Alex immediately called Agent Wu, who arranged for Ray to be placed under federal protection. The attempt to frame Ray backfired spectacularly when FBI forensic accountants discovered the planted evidence had actually created a trail leading to other fraudulent activities the company had been hiding. Meanwhile, Alex's grandmother had been released from the hospital and was recovering at home. The community had rallied around her and the other elderly residents, organizing volunteer groups to check on them regularly and ensure their apartments were properly maintained. Local contractors, outraged by the company's actions, donated their services to fix issues the management had been ignoring. The case was beginning to affect real estate practices nationwide. Other cities started launching their own investigations into similar schemes. Legal aid organizations began creating databases to track patterns of housing discrimination and fraud. Alex's methodical approach to documenting evidence became a model for community activists across the country. But the pressure was taking its toll on Alex. He was losing weight, sleeping only a few hours a night, and struggling to balance his jobs with case work and bar exam preparation. His mother noticed him dozing off one morning over breakfast, still wearing his security guard uniform from the night shift. "You can't help others if you destroy yourself," she said, gently taking away his law book. "Your father and I didn't come to this country and work so hard just to watch you work yourself sick." She insisted he take one day off each week to rest and spend time with family. That forced break turned out to be crucial. During one family dinner, as Alex listened to his sister talking about her high school economics class, something clicked in his mind. He began reviewing the company's financial records with a fresh perspective, looking for patterns he hadn't noticed before. Working with Agent Wu and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, Alex helped uncover how the company had been using their properties to inflate their assets and secure fraudulent loans. They would buy buildings, perform cosmetic repairs, evict long-term tenants, and then use the artificially increased property values to obtain multiple loans from different banks. The evidence was damning, but what really broke the case open was an unexpected ally, the company's former CFO. She had been quietly gathering evidence of financial misconduct for years, waiting for the right moment to come forward. When she saw how Alex's case was progressing, she decided it was time to act. The CFO's evidence provided the final pieces of the puzzle, showing how the company's schemes had affected not just housing but the entire city's economic structure. They had created a false property boom that had artificially inflated real estate prices across multiple neighborhoods, making housing unaffordable for thousands of families. As Alex prepared for another hearing with Judge Thompson, he received news that would change everything. The company's CEO and several top executives had been indicted by a federal grand jury. The charges included racketeering, wire fraud, money laundering, and witness tampering. In the courtroom, Alex stood before Judge Thompson once again, but this time he wasn't alone. Beside him were Agent Wu, the Attorney General, and a team of federal prosecutors. The gallery was packed with affected residents, community activists, and journalists. "Your Honor," Alex began, his voice steadied despite his exhaustion, "when I first came before this court, I was fighting for my grandmother's home. But this case has revealed something much bigger, a systematic abuse of power that has affected thousands of families and corrupted our city's institutions." Judge Thompson, who had watched Alex grow from an awkward young man in an ill-fitting suit to a respected legal advocate, listened intently as he presented the full scope of their findings. The evidence was irrefutable, showing how one company's greed had created ripples of hardship throughout the community. As Alex concluded his presentation, he looked back at his grandmother in the gallery. She was sitting straighter now, her head held high, surrounded by other residents who had become like family during their shared struggle. They had all grown stronger together, turning their individual struggles into a powerful movement for change. The judge's ruling was comprehensive. Beyond the criminal charges, he ordered the creation of a resident protection fund using seized company assets, implemented strict oversight measures for all major property developments, and established new requirements for affordable housing maintenance. As Alex left the courthouse that evening, a young woman stopped him. She explained that she was a law student who had been following his case. "You've changed how we think about housing rights," she said. "You've shown us that justice is possible if we're willing to fight for it." The weeks following the federal indictments brought a whirlwind of changes. Alex found himself juggling bar exam preparation with his role as a key witness in the upcoming criminal trials. The donated office space had evolved into an informal community center, where volunteers helped other residents document their housing issues and understand their rights. One morning, as Alex arrived at the office, he found an elderly man waiting outside. The man introduced himself as a retired judge who had served on the state Supreme Court. "I've been following your case," he said, his eyes twinkling. "How would you like some help preparing for the bar exam?" The offer came at the perfect time. Alex had been struggling to understand some of the more complex aspects of constitutional law, and the retired judge's mentorship proved invaluable. They would meet early in the mornings before Alex's security guard shift, discussing legal principles over coffee and breakfast burritos from the corner store. Meanwhile, the impact of the case continued to grow. The FBI's investigation had sparked similar probes in other cities, revealing a pattern of housing fraud that stretched across state lines. Real estate companies nationwide were facing increased scrutiny, and several had already begun reforming their practices to avoid similar investigations. Ray, still under federal protection, had become a key witness in the criminal cases. His detailed knowledge of the company's internal operations was proving crucial in understanding how they had managed to hide their illegal activities for so long. They never thought anyone would look too closely, he explained during a preparation session with federal prosecutors. They counted on people being too afraid or too poor to fight back. The former CFO's evidence had opened up new avenues of investigation. Federal authorities discovered that the company had been using their properties to launder money for international criminal organizations. What had started as a simple housing rights case had uncovered a vast network of financial crimes that stretched across multiple countries. Alex's grandmother, fully recovered from her illness, had become something of a local celebrity. Other elderly residents would gather in her apartment for tea, sharing stories and offering support to newcomers who were dealing with housing issues. She had started teaching other immigrants how to document problems and assert their rights, passing on the lessons she had learned from her grandson's fight. One afternoon, as Alex was reviewing case files, Agent Wu brought him some surprising news. The FBI had uncovered evidence that several other real estate companies had been using the same tactics. "Your case created a blueprint for investigating housing fraud," she explained. "We're now training agents specifically in the methods you developed." The pressure on Alex remained intense, but he had learned to handle it better. His family had insisted on creating a schedule that included regular breaks and family time. His sister had taken over managing the volunteer schedule at the office, showing the same organizational skills that had helped her brother build his case. The media attention had shifted from sensational headlines to serious investigative reporting. Journalists were diving deep into the systemic issues that had allowed the fraud to flourish. Alex's story was being used to illustrate how ordinary citizens could stand up to powerful interests and win. During one particularly challenging day of bar exam preparation, Alex received an unexpected visit from Judge Thompson. The judge had come to share some news. The State Bar Association was considering changes to their requirements, potentially creating a new path to legal certification for individuals who, like Alex, had demonstrated exceptional legal knowledge through practical experience. "You've shown that legal expertise isn't just about formal education," Judge Thompson said. "It's about dedication, understanding, and a commitment to justice. The law needs more people like you, people who understand the real-world impact of legal decisions on communities." The criminal trials were approaching, and Alex spent long hours helping federal prosecutors prepare their cases. Each piece of evidence told a story of how the company's actions had affected real people's lives. Behind the financial crimes and legal violations were thousands of personal stories of hardship and resilience. One evening, as Alex was leaving the federal building after another preparation session, he ran into the young law student who had spoken to him outside the courthouse. She had started a housing rights clinic at her law school, inspired by his case. "We're teaching students how to look for the patterns you identified," she explained. "Your methods are becoming part of the curriculum." The community continued to evolve and grow stronger. Local business owners who had faced similar pressure from real estate developers started forming associations to protect their rights. Tenant organizations in other cities reached out for advice on documenting violations and building cases against negligent landlords. Alex's parents watched their son's transformation with pride and concern. His father, who had worked as a dishwasher for 20 years to support his family, saw in Alex the embodiment of their dreams for a better life. His mother, while proud of his achievements, still worried about the toll the case was taking on him. The retired judge who had been mentoring Alex saw something special in his approach to law. "You haven't just learned legal principles," he told Alex during one of their morning sessions. "You've shown how the law can be a tool for community empowerment. That's something that can't be taught in law school." As the bar exam date approached, Alex found himself reflecting on how far he had come from that first day in court. The young man in the ill-fitting suit who had been laughed at was now helping to reshape housing law and inspire a new generation of legal advocates. The federal prosecutors had begun referring to the case as the Chun precedent, using it as a model for building complex fraud cases that connected housing violations to larger patterns of financial crime. Law enforcement agencies were developing new protocols based on the investigation's findings. One Saturday morning, as Alex took a rare break to help his grandmother tend to her small balcony garden, she shared some wisdom that put everything in perspective. "In our village," she said, planting a new herb cutting, "we had a saying, a single seed can grow into a forest. You planted a seed of justice, and look how it has grown." The impact of the case had extended far beyond housing rights. It had exposed how corruption in one sector could infect entire communities, and how ordinary citizens, armed with knowledge and determination, could fight back. Other whistleblowers, inspired by Ray's example, were coming forward in different industries, exposing similar patterns of fraud and abuse. As Alex prepared for the bar exam, he wasn't just studying for himself anymore. He was helping to create a new path for others who, like him, had gained their legal knowledge through real-world experience rather than traditional education. His story was becoming a symbol of hope for anyone who had been told they couldn't fight the system and win. The morning of the bar exam arrived with a mix of anticipation and nerves. Alex stood outside the testing center, clutching his worn briefcase that had become a symbol of his journey. Fellow test-takers, most of them fresh out of law school, glanced curiously at the young man whose case they had studied in their classes. Inside his briefcase, tucked between practice tests and study materials, was a letter from his grandmother. "Remember," she had written in her careful handwriting, "you were already a lawyer in your heart long before any exam." The words gave him strength as he walked into the testing room. The criminal trials had begun the week before, with the company's CEO and top executives facing multiple federal charges. Alex had spent long hours helping prosecutors prepare, ensuring that the human impact of the company's crimes remained at the center of the case. The courtroom was packed each day with affected residents, journalists, and law students studying this landmark case. During breaks in the bar exam, Alex couldn't help but think about Ray, who was scheduled to testify the following week. The former whistleblower had transformed from a nervous junior lawyer into a confident witness for justice. His testimony would be crucial in connecting the company's fraudulent practices to their broader criminal enterprise. The exam questions seemed to take on special meaning given Alex's unique experience. When asked about property law and civil procedure, he drew not just from his studies but from the real-world implications he had witnessed. The section on legal ethics made him think of all the choices he had faced during his fight for justice. As Alex completed the final section of the exam, he thought about how his journey had started with a simple desire to help his grandmother keep her home. That single case had sparked a movement that was now changing how the legal system approached housing rights and corporate fraud. The days following the exam were filled with more developments in the criminal trials. The former CFO's testimony had revealed how the company had created elaborate schemes to hide their illegal activities. But what struck Alex most was how she described the moment she decided to come forward. "I saw this young man fighting for his community and realized I couldn't stay silent anymore." One morning, as Alex arrived at the federal courthouse to observe the trials, he found a group of law students waiting to speak with him. They had started a nationwide network of housing rights clinics based on his methods. "We're teaching people how to document everything, just like you did," one student explained. "It's already helping communities stand up to predatory developers." The impact of the case continued to ripple outward. State legislatures across the country were introducing bills to strengthen tenant protections and increase oversight of real estate developments. The FBI had created a specialized unit dedicated to investigating housing-related financial crimes, using the investigation methods that had emerged from Alex's case. Judge Thompson, who had followed both the criminal trials and Alex's bar exam journey, invited him to chambers one afternoon. "You've changed more than just housing law," the judge said. "You've shown that justice is accessible to anyone willing to fight for it, regardless of their background or resources." The retired Supreme Court judge who had mentored Alex brought more good news. Several law schools had expressed interest in creating alternative pathways to legal certification, recognizing that valuable legal knowledge could be gained through real-world experience. They were calling it the Chen path to practice. Alex's family had noticed subtle changes in him. The weight of responsibility still showed in his eyes, but there was also a new confidence in his bearing. His sister joked that he had finally grown into that first ill-fitting suit, though he still preferred simple, comfortable clothes that reminded him of his roots. The community center that had grown out of the donated office space was thriving. Volunteer lawyers and law students staffed regular clinics, helping residents understand their rights and document housing issues. Alex's grandmother had started a senior advocacy group, ensuring that elderly residents had a strong voice in housing decisions. Ray, after completing his testimony, had decided to redirect his legal career toward public interest law. "You showed me that being a lawyer isn't just about winning cases," he told Alex. "It's about using the law to protect people who can't protect themselves." The former CFO's evidence had led to investigations of similar schemes in other industries. Federal authorities were discovering how the same patterns of fraud and corruption that had infected the housing market were present in healthcare, education, and other sectors that affected vulnerable communities. One evening, as Alex helped his mother prepare dinner, she shared a story he had never heard before. She described how, when they first immigrated, a kind housing lawyer had helped them avoid eviction from their first apartment. "Maybe that's why you were meant to do this work," she said, squeezing his hand. Sometimes justice comes full circle. The criminal trials were nearing their conclusion when Alex received the news he had been waiting for: he had passed the bar exam. The announcement came without fanfare, just an email that appeared on his phone while he was sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching justice unfold. His first action after reading the email was to visit his grandmother. She was in her garden, teaching other seniors how to grow vegetables on their balconies. When he told her the news, she hugged him tight and whispered, "Now you can help even more people." The significance of his achievement went beyond personal success. Alex had proven that the path to legal expertise could be forged through real-world experience and dedication to justice. His story was inspiring others who had been told they didn't belong in the legal profession because of their background or lack of traditional credentials. Agent Wu, who had become both a mentor and friend throughout the investigation, summed it up best during a celebration at the community center: "Some people study law to make money. Others study it to maintain the status quo. But Alex showed us that the law's true purpose is to protect the vulnerable and give voice to the voiceless." The company's executives were facing long prison sentences, but Alex's focus had already shifted to the future. He was working with housing rights organizations to develop training programs for community advocates, teaching them how to identify and document patterns of fraud and discrimination. As he walked through his old neighborhood, now protected from predatory development by new regulations and community oversight, Alex reflected on how much had changed. The same courthouse where people had once laughed at him now displayed a plaque commemorating the case that had transformed housing rights law. But for Alex, the most meaningful change was visible in the faces of his community members. People walked with their heads held higher, knowing they had the power to stand up for their rights. The fear that had once kept them silent had been replaced by knowledge and solidarity. The day of the final verdict in the criminal trials dawned clear and bright. The courthouse steps were crowded with community members, journalists, and supporters who had followed the case from its humble beginnings. Alex sat in the front row of the courtroom, his grandmother beside him, as the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The company's executives faced decades in prison for their roles in the massive fraud scheme. But more importantly, the verdict represented vindication for thousands of families whose lives had been affected by corporate greed and corruption. As people celebrated outside the courthouse, Alex found himself thinking about his first day there, when he had stood alone in his ill-fitting suit. Now, as a newly licensed attorney, he wore a properly tailored suit bought with his first paycheck from the Attorney General's office, where he had accepted a position leading a new housing rights enforcement division. The former CFO, who had become a key witness for the prosecution, approached Alex after the verdict. "You know," she said quietly, "when I first saw you in court that day, I thought you were just some naive kid. But you showed us all what real courage looks like. You made it impossible for people like me to keep looking the other way." The impact of the case continued to grow. Law schools across the country had begun incorporating the PCHN method into their curriculum, teaching students how to identify patterns of corporate fraud by looking at their effects on vulnerable communities. The FBI's Housing Crimes Unit had already uncovered similar schemes in several other cities, using the investigative blueprint developed during Alex's case. Ray had found his calling as a public interest lawyer, working with community organizations to prevent housing discrimination. "Remember when I was afraid to come forward?" he reminded Alex over coffee one morning. "Now I'm teaching other whistleblowers how to safely expose corporate wrongdoing. Your case changed everything." Alex's grandmother's apartment building had become a model for community-managed housing. The residents' association she helped create had taken over management of the property, using funds from the settlement to make improvements and ensure affordable rents for long-term tenants. Other buildings in the city were following their example. The community center had evolved into a full-fledged legal aid clinic, staffed by volunteer attorneys and law students. Alex spent his evenings there, mentoring the next generation of advocates. "The law isn't just about knowing cases and statutes," he would tell them. "It's about understanding how legal decisions affect real people's lives." Judge Thompson, who had become a mentor and friend, invited Alex to speak at a judicial conference about the case's impact on legal education and practice. "What we witnessed wasn't just the exposure of a criminal enterprise," the judge told the assembled justices. "It was a demonstration of how ordinary citizens, armed with knowledge and determination, can transform our legal system." Agent Wu had been promoted to lead a new task force investigating corporate fraud nationwide. "Your case taught us to look beyond individual violations," she explained to Alex during a training session for new agents. "You showed us how to connect the dots between housing discrimination and larger patterns of financial crime." Alex's parents had finally retired from their multiple jobs, supported by the community they had helped strengthen. His father, who had spent decades washing dishes in restaurant kitchens, now taught cooking classes at the community center. His mother volunteered with immigrant advocacy groups, helping newcomers understand their rights. The young law student who had been inspired by Alex's case was now running her own housing rights clinic at her law school. She had developed a program that paired law students with community organizations, creating a new model for legal education that emphasized practical experience and social justice. One morning, as Alex prepared for his first case as lead attorney for the Housing Rights Division, he received a letter from a small town across the country. A group of residents there had used his methods to document similar housing fraud in their community. They had already gathered enough evidence to launch an investigation. "Your fight gave us hope," they wrote. "It showed us that we don't have to accept injustice, no matter how powerful the people causing it might be." The legal profession itself was changing. Bar associations in several states had adopted new rules allowing alternative paths to certification for individuals who, like Alex, demonstrated exceptional legal knowledge through practical experience. The PCHN path to practice was opening doors for others who had gained their expertise outside traditional channels. During a celebration dinner at their family apartment, Alex's sister announced that she had decided to become a lawyer too. "But I'm doing it the Alex way," she said with a grin. "I'm going to work with community organizations first, learn from real people's experiences, then go to law school." The retired Supreme Court judge who had mentored Alex through the bar exam had begun writing a book about the case and its implications for legal education. "What you achieved goes beyond just winning in court," he told Alex. "You've shown us that legal expertise can grow from the ground up, from the real needs and experiences of communities." The company's former buildings, now managed by community organizations, had become centers for neighborhood revitalization. Gardens flourished on rooftops, small businesses opened in previously vacant storefronts, and residents worked together to maintain affordable housing for families who had lived there for generations. Alex kept his security guard badge as a reminder of where he had started. Sometimes, late at night while preparing for a case, he would look at it and remember the long hours he had spent studying law books during his night shifts, dreaming of a day when he could help make the legal system work for everyone. One evening, as he walked home from the community center, Alex passed the courthouse where his journey had begun. The building looked different now, not because it had changed, but because he saw it through new eyes. It was no longer an intimidating symbol of power, but a tool for achieving justice, accessible to anyone brave enough to fight for what was right. His grandmother's words from the beginning of their fight echoed in his mind: "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage." What had begun as one young man's fight to save his grandmother's home had grown into a movement that was transforming how communities across the country stood up for their rights. As Alex unlocked the door to his office the next morning, ready to start work on new cases, he smiled at the framed photo on his desk. It showed him in that first ill-fitting suit, standing on the courthouse steps. Below it was a quote that had become his guiding principle: "Justice doesn't require expensive suits or fancy degrees. It just needs people willing to stand up for what's right." The laughter that had once filled that courtroom had been replaced by something far more powerful: the sound of people standing together, raising their voices for justice, and proving that one person's courage could inspire thousands to fight for change.